Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about something very bad is going to happen, episode 6. It's called Last Night of Freedom. Spoilers for the episode as always, and this is a Patreon sponsored review, so thank you very much to Alison for making the pick. So this episode neatly kind of breaks down into two branches. There's two plots going on. One is Rachel grabbing Nell in the morning after her big speech at the rehearsal dinner and going to the city records office and breaking in with a lockpick to look through potential family history. The other half of it is the men, Nikki and Jules with their father, hunting foxes, but more importantly, kind of talking about their history, their feelings, what's going on, and that kind of thing. What's funny about this is that I actually think for like the first half of the episode, I kind of thought it might have been like the strongest episode so far. Just mainly just because it was one very focused, and it felt like for the first time in the show, there was something kind of proactive being done to try and play within the rules that have been set up, which is that Rachel wants to look at the history of her family, look at birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, and figure out like if anyone has beat this in the past, right? Because she's assuming that since like her family line is still going, it made it to her, and this was something that happened 150 or so years ago, then presumably some people in her family tree have been able to get married and beat the curse. Now admittedly, her logic's not 100% in there, because like people can have kids outside of marriage. In fact, that's how she was kind of born, is that she was conceived early enough that by the time the wedding came, she could still be saved from her dying mother. So, like, there is a way around that and still have the family tree going on, but I appreciated the logical approach, and then her and Nell looking through all the paperwork, making a family tree out of it, and a couple of things accomplished from this. One is that it kind of confirms that the curse is probably real, because so many of the women, or even just the women and men in her family, died on their wedding day from a hemorrhage. Right? Several. Like, too many to be a coincidence. It's far too frequent, going all the way up and down the tree. However, the other thing that this also does, though, is that there are some people in her family who just avoided getting married, which is the obvious trick to beating this, actually, is to just never accept a proposal. Rachel actually says out loud that once you've accepted a proposal, that's it, you're locked into the curse, which I feel like that's a bit of an assumption on her part. I don't think it ever actually, or the witness never told her that. Maybe she read that in the contract that she got from him. Maybe that was in there, but I don't know if he ever clarified that exactly, because that was one of the questions I had. But it does make it clear, though, that for people in the family who maybe knew about the curse, right, and she suspects that some of the people who were closer to the start of the curse probably did know about it, they just avoided ever actually getting married. They probably still lived with someone. They probably still acted as if they were married for a chunk of their life, potentially, but they just never actually, proposed or accepted a proposal and made a date for a wedding, and therefore never had to deal with the curse. But everyone who did get married died, and that's kind of reinforcing that the curse is in play and that Rachel's already past that point of no return. So it's like, okay, it's establishing the rules further, it's proving them right, it's convincing Nell, who wasn't necessarily believing all this before, but this is pretty compelling evidence to suggest that maybe it is true, maybe not ironclad, but certainly is pointing a lot of fingers in one direction. However, after they've bonded a little bit, they've had a heart-to-heart about stuff, they keep looking for more, and Nell finds one example, one person, her great aunt, who did get married and did not die on her wedding day, and stayed married for 50 plus years afterwards, and died until, I think she died in like 1979, they said. So immediately Rachel's like, oh, we've got an example, I need to talk to her. And Nell's like, she's dead, but I need to talk to her. Still dead. So what's so weird about this is that, like, obviously it sounds like she's got some kooky idea to try and talk to a ghost, or use a Ouija board or whatever it is. But the progression after this point was kind of strange to me, which is it ends up almost being coincidental that Portia, who's throwing the bachelorette party during this day and is mad at those two for being missing all day, happens to like have the supplies for this, and seems to maybe have a bit of a history with trying to summon the dead, because it's a party trick or something, even though she admits later that it's never actually worked. But regardless, she sets up the spirit board, she gets them all ready, she's got a few rules about how you light the candle and say your question and whatever. And for me, that was kind of where the episode kind of went off the rails a little bit, is once it actually became about contacting a spirit, and we got kind of the what do we call it, the demon dog POV of the growling, and like the camera's moving really quickly around, and eventually we find out that it's possessed Portia for the message at the end. But you know, Portia gets hit in the face and she's just insufferable. She's insufferable when she's complaining about her nose being bloody. She's insufferable when we first see her and she's giving Rachel shit for being late, and about how this wedding's important to her brother and the family, and she won't let her ruin it, blah blah blah. She's just kind of an insufferable character, which, to be fair, it's consistent. That's been her shtick the entire time. I can't really complain too much about that. But I actually did like the first half of this, which was them going to the records office and trying to piece these things together. They do also acknowledge here, by the way, that almost all of her family, like, either get married or died in this area, right? It's all local, and she's like, hey, is this place like some kind of like supernatural nexus? Is it like a trap to lure people into their death? Nell kind of downplays that and says maybe it's just a coincidence, but it's a pretty big coincidence given that none of them actually live here. You know, like, so, well, we don't know that for all of them, but certainly the examples we know about didn't live here. They just came here for their wedding through one reason or another. So anyway, I think that first half is interesting because it's them being proactive. They're trying to establish the history, and is there examples? Is there almost like a legal case? Is there a precedent for getting through this unscathed? And if so, how did they manage it? Like, what qualified someone being your soulmate? And Nell even postures at one point, like, don't you get to decide that to a certain extent? Like, is it some cosmic thing that a spirit has already decided for you? Or is it just about how much you believe they're your soulmate, and therefore it becomes true because you have chosen them as your soulmate? Which is a philosophical question more than anything else, but it's an interesting thing to pose. Now, I also liked how this ended, actually. Not so much the possessed Portia running in after the more POV demon dog stuff. I thought that looked still a bit lame, but not necessarily that it looks bad per se, but just more that it feels very kind of derivative of other things. You know, like, we've all seen the camera floating in Evil Dead and whatever, and the growling didn't make it any less cheesy. But I did like the turn of events that Nell and Rachel share a moment, and you know, like, Nell confesses that her and Jules are getting divorced, and afterwards gives Rachel a kiss on the lips, and it's very notable on the lips. It's just a peck. It's not like a long passionate kiss or anything, but it is very intimate in the sense that it's on the lips. And the way Rachel kind of looks back at her and gives her a little smile, like, obviously it's confirmed like a minute later when we see them properly making out, but like, even just in that moment I thought, oh, a spark has happened. Oh, this might actually be your soulmate, which does raise some interesting questions, doesn't it? So obviously we know that if she backs out of the wedding, the curse is passed on to the family she was going to get married into, meaning Nikki's family, which, funnily enough, is if Nell's getting divorced, she would be, you know, separate from that. She wouldn't be part of that family anymore. I think she gets out scot-free in that case. But what if, in the process of almost getting married, you actually find your true soulmate? What are the rules then exactly? If you switch to the real soulmate, does the other family still get cursed because you backed out? Or if she goes on to marry her real soulmate, assuming that Nell is her real soulmate, does that just end the curse and everyone down the line is like freed from it, including any families that have been infected along the way? I mean, I don't know. I'm just putting forth some ideas here, but that was the big thing. I actually think this revelation that they have got some feelings for each other, or they've been spending some time together. Nell's helped her out here or there. They spent all day together this episode, and it felt like they were bonding. And Nell was trying to make her feel better, and she wasn't trying to sabotage things. Like, you know, there was kind of like a theory from Nikki early on that, oh, maybe Nell's going to not give her good advice because we used to date. She'll, you know, be, if not jealous, but maybe just vengeful because she wants to ruin things for him, not necessarily because she wants him back or anything like that. But no, she's given decent advice. She seems to actually clearly want to help, even though she is very cynical. Maybe being with Jules for some time is kind of a reason for that. But I do think it does make some sense, and she has more chemistry with Nell than she does with Nikki, if I'm honest. Just from a, watching a TV show perspective, it just feels like there's not that much chemistry between the two leads, which usually would be a complaint. But I think in this show's case, it was probably intentional, given where the story's going. They probably wanted us to feel like they're not perfect for each other because it feeds into the whole paranoia of where the plot's going. So in that case, it's an intentional choice, in which case, good job, I guess. It's a weird compliment to give, but I think in this case, it actually makes sense. So yeah, wasn't into the whole summoning stuff, and Rachel tries it again in the bedroom afterwards, because the thing did move on its own that one time before Portia got headbutted by a ghost. So there was something to it at the very least. But she's questioning, Nicky lied about the plane, he invited my dad to the wedding, and that's, if he knew me well enough, he shouldn't have done that. He's doing stuff based on lies, which does kind of feed into the Nicky side of the plot. And I think the Nicky side of the plot is, it's a lot of it's like him and his dad and his brother, and kind of talking about what life's going to be like once mum's gone and all that. But to me, the standout sequence from their side is when Nicky and Jules are left alone one-on-one when the dad goes to piss. And Jules tries to talk about what happened the night before. Nicky doesn't want to talk, but a lot of stuff comes out in this scene, a lot of their history. Something that I guess never really occurred before, even though it's obvious, is that if Nell's Nicky's ex, then it means Jules married his brother's ex, right? Which is kind of weird, but what comes up in this conversation is that Jules was in love with her, like, from before they were together, right? Like, he even says that Nick, you knew I liked her and you started dating her anyway. And Nicky's like, I didn't know that. You're trying to make me like the bad guy, like I took something from you. So we're getting into some of the petty history and some of kind of the more complex web of like why there's like weird feelings between them and all that. But what I thought was most interesting though, because it felt like an actual genuine bit of character analysis here, is when Jules, while admitting that maybe he is a bit of a dick and whatever else, he does point out that Nicky not going to the wedding, one, could be seen as him feeling weird because his ex is getting married to his brother, which isn't that unwild, it's not that wild a thing to say. But also, he points out that you did this not because you actually had to do something that day. You saw an opportunity for a good story, and you took that anyway, and basically accuses Nicky of always going for whatever the good story is, and that he's more attracted to the perfect story than he is to a person. And he even says, it's not even your fault that you're like that. Mum and Dad made you that way because Mum and Dad presented us with this perfect marriage, especially to you. They hid all the bad stuff and made it seem picture perfect so that you had this pressure to go and find the perfect meet cute, the perfect girl, the perfect story of how you got together, all this stuff. And you tried to fabricate that because that's what the parents kind of like shoved down your throat in a way, even though it doesn't sound like a bad thing to present to your children in a sense. But if you're hiding the truth, then maybe you're setting up some unrealistic expectations. And I thought that was an interesting thing to come out, because it felt like in that moment I was actually siding more with Jules, because it felt like he was being honest. And he is a dick, right? And he is cynical and he's not very pleasant to be around. But this felt like a genuine attempt to actually talk about what he thinks of his brother in a way that didn't feel like he was trying to attack him or cause a rift or anything like that. He was just trying to honestly say, this is what I think your problem is, and why maybe your relationship's built on something of a lie is because you just tried to turn it into the perfect relationship. It wasn't actually that naturally. So, there's that, and then that feeds into kind of the later revelation when the dad confesses to Nicky. We kind of end that scene in a cliffhanger where the dad's like, hey, I need to tell you something. Your mother made me promise never to tell you. But we see the follow-up to that is Nicky goes into her room and demands to know if it's true that his mother cheated on his father when before he was even born, which I thought he was going down the rabbit hole of, oh, his father's this other man, that he didn't know. It never actually gets to that line of questioning, so I don't think they're actually necessarily hinting at that. They could still say that later on, but they never actually went down that path. And well, it'll have to be his dad that answers now, because the mother dies before the end of the scene. She just kind of stops talking and moving in the middle, and it's kind of like a shock surprise in the middle. But he's mad at her. He's mad that his belief in his parents' perfect marriage was always a lie. And she's like, does it make a difference? Was that such a bad thing to believe? So she's not necessarily taking responsibility for this deception. He's very rightfully pissed about it, and I think he's right to. Yeah, I think he's got a right to be upset that this was kept from him to some extent. Admittedly, it is kind of murky territory in a sense, because it's not. It's like, it makes sense here that he's pissed, because the whole idea is that his parents have like fed them this lie that their marriage has been perfect and you have to live up to our standard, only to find out that that wasn't entirely true. And they've had their problems, and in some ways that could actually be more inspiring, that we've had problems and we were able to get through it, and our marriage is stronger than it was before, and this is how we did that. There could be a lot of good things to teach from that. And arguably, if like a couple have some issues like that and someone cheats before your kid's even born, and then you fix things up, you patch things up before the kid comes along, do you actually have to tell the kid that something happened before they existed? I mean, maybe it's a little bit weird here because there was older siblings that maybe were aware of it, so it's a bit of an imbalance if that's the case. But it's an interesting question if it doesn't actually affect them, and maybe if they had sort of admitted and had fought in front of the kids occasionally and said that they had to work through their problems, it wouldn't be that big a deal to find this out later on. Like, it would still, you'd feel something for hearing that your parents went through this before you were born. But if it was something that was all closed up and dealt with before you were even around, and nothing's happened since, I mean, I don't know if it does affect you. It's actually a weird question. It's actually a very complicated thing now that I'm thinking about it, honestly. Like how much would it have affected me if I'd found out my parents had cheated on each other before I was born? I actually don't know. Would I care? Would I actually care that much? I don't know if I would care that much, but I think I get why Nikki cares based on everything that's set up in this episode. So, it's an interesting detail. Now, to be fair, my parents weren't married before I was born, so maybe that's also a factor there. But like, it's I don't know. It's a complicated question, and it does kind of feed into the themes of like your family history and what's led to like your current predicament, because that's what Rachel's going through, right? Her family has this curse because of something that happened generations and generations ago, and she's having to deal with that. And Nicky is now dealing with the generational trauma of something that happened to his parents. If anything, it feels like the biggest theme of this show at this point is maybe generational trauma, even though at first glance it might be, oh no, it's more about like picking the right person. And that's still a big part of it, don't get me wrong. The love of your life and all that is still a big part of the show, but it feels like the generational trauma is maybe more what it's been building up to throughout all this. And now the mother's dead, which, it'd be wild for them to be like, we're still doing the wedding tomorrow. I mean, admittedly, maybe Rachel's the one who says, hey, we have to do the wedding or I'm going to die. That's why we're going to do the wedding, not because I'm being disrespectful to your mother's death. So that would actually be understandable. But in any normal circumstances, if like the parent of one of the people getting married died the night before the wedding, I feel like most people would call off the wedding. I suppose maybe the reason why you wouldn't is if you got an expensive venue and you paid for everything, and like all that was going to go to waste if you didn't get married. I guess maybe in that case you probably would want to still get married. But assuming it's not some big extravagant thing, and I feel like movies make it seem like everyone has that. I think it's actually not that true. I think probably at least half of people don't have a big wedding where they're spending tons of money. But I guess in that case you might still get married. But still, you would think about it though. It would be difficult. It would definitely put a damper on the day, which is why, even outside of being respectful or not being respectful to the person who died, you're not exactly in the mood for romance, are you? You're not like feeling happy on your wedding day if one of your parents just died the night before. It doesn't, you'd be pretty down about it, and you wouldn't necessarily want to be feeling that going into the wedding when it's that raw. There's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't, beyond just it might be disrespectful. But anyway, is there anything else I wanted to add about the episode? In some way, like in some ways, I still think it's the strongest episode because I think it got to the meat of the characters a little bit more, and I liked Rachel being proactive about trying to figure out if someone had beat it. Like she was like, okay, what information do I have that I can use, and what can I find out, and how can that help me? There was a genuine attempt when it went into the supernatural. Let's try and talk to a dead person. Because before they said that the person died, I was like, oh shit, we're going to go on a road trip. Like, they live 3 hours away or something like that. We're going to go find them, and she's going to talk to her great aunt who's like 80. But then they said she died in 1979, and I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess we're not doing that. And then it became a bit of seance. So, yeah. I don't know, it's kind of weird. It's almost like, even though I know we have a death curse, it's got a death curse. Sorry, that's Crazy Ralph from Friday the 13th I'm doing there. But even though it's got a death curse, it still kind of feels weird when it leans more into supernatural stuff, bizarrely. Like, I almost feel like it would be to its benefit to not overdo that stuff. Because I kind of liked when Nell said, wait, you talked to this man who is 200 years old. That was the other thing the paperwork showed, is that it was the same witness signature on every single bit of paper. And she's like, that's not possible. He'd have to be like 200 years old. And Rachel's like, yeah, I talked to him. He told me this. And she was like, you spoke to the immortal man. And she's like, yeah. I actually appreciated how insane that sounded as she was saying it. And she's like being, skeptical, because that does sound kind of insane. But, but then we get like demon dog POVs and like, possessed Portia giving her a weird message that maybe is the message she has to follow. Luckily, it's the title of the next episode, so I can actually just tell you what she says verbatim here. She says, something living, something dead, something stolen, something red, which is obviously a spin on the old something blue thing for weddings. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know, we'll see. We got 2 episodes left. Next day is the wedding date, so I don't know how the next 2 episodes are going to be split up. Is it going to be like building up to the ceremony, and then all the last episode takes place during and after the ceremony, or what? I don't know. But yeah, we'll find out. So anyway, there you go. That's something very bad is going to happen in episode 6. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments below. Like, subscribe, all that stuff helps out a bunch if you can. And of course, if you want to support everything, you can do that over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and help keep everything coming. Also check out MailFuzz Movies, where all the movie podcasts live. But that's me. Thank you very much for joining. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?